The first thing I'd like to mention, and I know I'm speaking on Kurt's behalf as well, is to thank Rich Grassi and Kevin O'Reilly for stepping in for us when we both unexpectedly had to travel last meeting on business. Now, hopefully that won't happen again when we both have to be gone, but thank you very much. For those of you who have had an opportunity very briefly to see the minutes from the June 7th meeting, I don't know how Alan continues to do it, but the quick turnaround was great, and I sent an email to everybody with the minutes, and I'm gonna resend the May minutes as well. And what I'm proposing that we do is that at our July 18th meeting, we just roll up all three, the May, the June 7th, the June 20th, and take care of those minutes at that time. Is there any objection to handling it that way? So everybody has a chance. We have a motion? We have a second? Second? All in favor? Aye. Unanimous. I'd like to just start by, I'm actually gonna quote something that Mr. O'Reilly said in our absence last week, was that Kevin suggested that the panel hear the updates on the working group chairs and defer substantive discussions to next meeting. Well, this is the next meeting, and the substantive discussions will continue. The plan for this evening is we have at least two more major additions from the working groups that were not available at the last. Some have been included in the second version of the draft, which I hope you had with a little bit more time to read. After this evening's meeting, what I'm suggesting that would probably be the best to do is to handle the two new ones we have, as we did the last time, allowing the chairs of the working group to walk us through what they have prepared and to have a discussion about that. And then I'd like to go back during the rest of the discussion period, and I noted that there were a lot of comments about the individual pieces. My hope and goal for all of us is that when we conclude this evening's meeting with public input, that I will be able to turn around for you by around Monday, a new version of the draft, version 3, so that we'll have quite a bit of time prior to the July meeting to put it together. I think it's personally much more important that we do a good document that we've all had plenty of time to look at beforehand, rather than trying to, June 20th was the date, but that's okay. If we do it July, let's try to get it done for July. Any comment on that approach? Well, with that, then, we're gonna do three things first. One, Paul, you wanted to make a quick motion.
Yes, I did, through the chair.
Please.
Prior to the review or vote of NDCAP tonight, I would respectfully request that it be preceded by a review of the recommendations of the Site Cleanup and Restoration Subcommittee. The recommendations specifically are contained pages 20 through 24 of the draft report. And if the chair would indulge me, my rationale, my basis for that was that the subcommittee has met almost as often as NDCAP, I think equal to. It has explored specific subjects. It has a lot of communication, represents a number of presentations. There was indeed healthy debate. It was a diverse makeup, including citizenry, state authorities, state departments, and the licensee. Now, not all the areas of concern to the NDCAP were included, but the specific areas on page 22 to 24 were explored in depth, debated at length, and consensus was beaten into us by a good chairwoman. Okay, thanks, Anna, for her patience with us. The recommendations were unanimously accepted, with all the disciplines being represented at the meeting on 6/13. Again, much credit to our chair, Ms. Pine. And the intent of this motion is not to diminish debate, but rather to recognize there is some repetition in some of the findings. Okay, and that this, by considering these to be universal areas that are subject to all the subcommittees, I think it would allow NDCAP to focus on more of the specific areas. So it's in an effort to make the committee more efficient without suggesting anything about the depth of the scope.
Does anyone feel we need a second or a vote on this, or do we all understand what Paul's trying to say?
I'm not so sure, Mr. Chairman, I understand the motion.
Okay.
Neither do I.
Paul, do you want to go through it again, what you're asking the full panel to do? I'm not sure we need a vote on this, because, but explain again what you're trying to get across.
What I'm trying to say is the first thing we should consider tonight is perhaps out of sequence, maybe it's not out of sequence. But the first thing we should consider is the findings and recommendations of the site cleanup and restoration subcommittee.
Let me try to phrase it, see if I got it right, and then, so these recommendations were done after almost as many meetings, if not more, than the NDCAP itself.
That is correct.
Broad deliberations, very diverse, and then unanimously adopted.
Yes, sir.
So that, what I'm hearing you say is, would you like to have the full NDCAP now? Someone make a motion to adopt these for inclusion in the report, since it was done unanimously by the working group, and that, is that what you're saying?
I would not be so bold as to suggest that.
Okay.
Without the committee here.
Sure.
May I speak
Fine.
to just a couple of things? We were not a full committee that night. Mr. Priest was not with us that night, and I know that he, had some amount of offerings on the specifically the radiation that we did not take up in his absence.
Yeah.
To the extent that I believe we would have had he been there.
Okay.
So I just want to clarify that, and although we did meet probably 5 or 6 times, I don't think it was as often as the handicap.
Okay.
So just for clarification
Yeah.
purposes only, I'm happy to do whatever.
I can clarify that also.
Yes.
I'm not a member of the working group.
Yeah.
Provided some technical expertise and some background information from my agency to the working group.
Excellent. Joseph?
I'm a little confused, Paul. My understanding is that the recommendations from each of the working groups is going to be included in the report, the final report, under the appropriate sections. But is there supposed to be then a separate, because I'm confused.
Okay.
Unfortunately, I wasn't here the last meeting. I thought the report was going to have the, however many findings and recommendations from the entire panel, whether that was 5 or 10 or 15 or whatever it
Yep.
wound up being. But then all of the findings and recommendations, to the extent you want to put them in as is in the appropriate sections for those work groups, would just appear as they were submitted, or if there's duplication in some of them, if there was a decision to, say, pick one, let's just say there was one finding and recommendation that came out of 3 different work groups.
Yep.
If the panel wants to just put them in as is, or just to say, look, let's just pick one on that particular topic and put that one in. I don't know what the
Let me-
decisions have been on.
I don't believe there's been a hard, fast decision, but I think what we've been working toward is that all of the working groups would roll up in the same basic format of what they've done, who the members are, what the activities were, what the findings were, and what the recommendations were. Those would get rolled up into the type of section that Pine and the group have put together. Then the full committee, full panel, would look at that and would discuss it. And if it were adopted by the working group, and then the full panel adopts it, votes to do it, then that's what goes in. Now, to the point of the duplication, and Jack is, I don't know, Jack, did you share your matrix with anybody else but me? Your little table?
You and Kurt.
Okay. Jack, why don't you explain what you sent to me, because it ties into this whole idea that there might be in multiple places. And having been sort of the compiler of this, I see it, I think, perhaps better than anybody, but a lot of them have a different slant to it. So it's not exactly, it could be the same issue. The finding might be similar, but the recommendation might be different because it's from a different perspective, whether it's safety or whether it's from the PSDAR. So it might be appropriate to leave it in. But Jack, if you don't mind taking a few minutes and just explain to folks what your suggestion was.
So I went through the first draft, and I pretty much got the idea from the senator here of difficult to go through all of the recommendations and all of the findings. So I simply took all of the text and I pulled that from all of the working groups out. And then I put them into a matrix on a table, and then I binned them. So where the cleanup group might have had something in there, the finance group might have had something similar in there, or one of the other, the safety group may have something in there. So those common topic areas I lumped together and then attempted to consolidate them. So the table ended up, what I thought we could do in the report was to have an executive summary letter describing what the subcommittees did, and then attach an attachment that you could track going forward and add to if we needed to. So it would be like a living table that would have a recommendation, a finding, or a finding, and then a recommendation, and then a comments column to add additional information if any panel member or subcommittee so choose.
What I'd like to suggest, I took a look at it, and it appeared to me to be a very good format by bidding them for a technical document. It's very typical of what you'll see in a technical document. My own personal opinion on it, and my suggestion was that we should use that, post the report, for our internal to keep track of where we are, because it's very much like a Microsoft project.
Yeah.
You look at it.
That's what I used
to do
to
it.
put that together.
So
But
it's really good for working with, but that for a report by a volunteer-based organization, I think the way we're going is probably a better format. But I'd ask you for a favor, if you don't mind distributing it tomorrow.
Sure.
To everybody, to take a look at the format. I think it has a great deal of value. My own personal opinion, and I want you guys to look at it, is it just doesn't fit exactly for what we want in this first report. But I think everybody should have a chance to look at it.
I just thought, just looking at the words, and
Yeah.
I'm not trying to be critical of how we're doing it, just if I was an external person reading this, and
Yeah.
this will be the governor's
Yeah,
staff
sure.
people and all reading it, that I think you could get lost in the words with a lot of subcommittees and similar findings and a lot of duplication. So it might not be clear what exactly we're asking for. So
I agree.
my thought was to, if we want to have a combination of the text format and then an addendum or
And
a summary,
appendices, yeah.
appendices,
That might be the end
it
result.
might be easier for people to work their way through those.
Well, I gotta say, personally, just thank you for putting all the time into it to do that, because that was no small task. I can attest from trying to do it with the narrative. Any other comments before we move? Yes, Kurt?
So I have carefully read the second draft. It's probably an understatement to say I'm struggling a lot with the format and the content. When we focus on 5 working groups and all of these recommendations, and I read them carefully, I find myself objecting to a lot of individual words, phrases, expressions of what seem to be often be personal opinion, expressions that, of statements that you would expect need to be made by subject matter experts, which in some cases are not being made by subject matter experts. So I'm trying to figure out how to be comfortable with what we're going forward with. And I thought coming here that what this panel was going to be asked to do is to, by working group, be briefed on the finding and recommendations, and that we were all going to then offer motions to amend and see if we could get recommendations to somewhere where the majority of the panel approved each recommendation. I think that's a task that would take days and days to accomplish, and I don't know how we're going to do that. I'm starting to think that maybe you're looking to approach this a different way, which is to have a report in which each the report simply, not simply, the report is going to include something written by each working group, which the working group says, this is what we like, even though many of us may object or not. And so I'm really struggling with this because I don't think we should have a report that has something called a recommendation in it unless the full panel has adopted that recommendation. And I'll stop by saying, as I got here tonight, it dawned on me that what I want to suggest as a path forward is to say that I think it's premature in this first report to have all of these working group recommendations, because we have not, as a panel, had an opportunity to have any working group take a night and say, let's talk about where we are a year later after a year of work. I'd be much more comfortable issuing an annual report that starts off the way you've started it off with, here is the panel, here is its responsibilities, its authorities, its members, here's what we have focused on for a year as a panel, here are 4 recommendations that the panel has adopted, and then here are individual working group reports, which are mission, scope, focal areas, indicating where the working groups are focused. But I think it's premature to have all of these recommendations, because I just don't know how we're going to get to.
Let me respond. First of all, it's always been my impression, and if anybody here agrees with this impression, that the full panel would vote on any recommendation from every one of the working groups. The idea was, I believe, to bring it to us, much as was discussed at the last meeting when you and I couldn't be here. And there was a full discussion of each one of these. We've got at least 2 more tonight to do like that. And I would, say, why don't we reserve judgment on that portion of it until after we go through it? Because I agree. And does anybody disagree that the full panel has to vote on each of these recommendations? Richard?
I totally agree with what Kurt has said. Having been involved in the report, I think separating it out by working groups and having them meet independently and come up with their own findings and recommendations, and then come back here and to work on a specific working group's finding and recommendations and vote on them or whatever. We're not taking into consideration what Joe said, which I know exists because I did the entire first draft with you.
Yeah.
Duplication throughout the report.
Yeah.
I totally agree with Kurt. I think starting it off with the front matter, having the 4 basic recommendations, and then instead of working group, identify the working groups, yes, but take each subject of the working group, in other words, what the working group is focusing on, and then have a general discussion from the working group that incorporates not findings and recommendations, but generally the gist of what's in the findings and recommendations. I think that would solve the problem.
I have to respectfully disagree. Personally, I think there are many recommendations that are contained in what I've read from the working group so far that need to be considered and voted on by the panel. And I'll just give a couple of quick examples. One is the placement of the next pad. The placement of the next dry cast storage pad. That is something that's critical from a timing point of view. Our friends at Entergy feel the same way. I think that one's a no-brainer for us to have a full discussion and take a vote on. I don't think a lot of the more subtle ones have to be, but I don't know how everybody on the panel feels.
With all due respect, Sean, what does that have to do with an annual report?
We are providing advice. That is the fundamental purpose of the organization. It is an advisory panel.
Okay.
We're providing advice. Kevin?
I think we're on a path where we spent a considerable amount of time at the last meeting going through two of the working group reports. I think we should continue down that path.
Yeah.
We should have the discussion and come back, and I think there's probably a middle ground where
I agree.
we'll see, maybe we don't need to focus a lot on this right now, but I think we need to go through them all and as a group decide which recommendations from the working groups should rise to the top and which shouldn't. But unless we have that discussion, we're never gonna get there.
I agree. Do you agree with that, Craig?
I have it, let's see how the process
Okay.
goes. Having not been here last week, I understand there was a lot of discussion about recommendations and wording from two working groups, but no votes.
Right.
So, so I don't know where that discussion left people. Is there something that's been amended to reflect a consensus that, or do we now have to go back and look? I mean, so where do we go from what you folks did last week on two working groups if there were no votes?
Can I answer that, Sean?
Yeah, please.
We had a very good discussion last week. The fact that we decided, Kevin and I and the whole group decided not to have vote made absolute sense. And once we got to the discussion of the PSDAR and the safety and security, we realized that we had to wait for the minutes and to see how thorough the minutes were in capturing the subjects of the discussion, the objections, and so forth. And on the basis of the minutes, we had to go back to the report sections, dealing with those two issues, change them, and then come back for vote.
Yeah. And the way I'm envisioning it, one second, Jack, that's what'll occur at next month's meeting. Because there will be ample time for everybody to have commented, read the minutes, and now we can have a final discussion on each one. That's what I'm envisioning. But as Kevin just said, it may work out to be something in between that. I don't know yet. Yeah, Joe, and then I want to get to Jack and then the.
Question, because the work group meetings were public, regardless of whether members of the public attended or not, every one of them, I would think, but I don't know this, I would think then that whatever products each work group came up with need to be in the annual report simply as is. But I also agree with Kurt's comment that the panel itself needs to have its official recommendation section. And whether there's 50 recommendations from the 5 different work groups in their sections, and there winds up being only 5 that the panel in the end agrees should go forward as panel recommendations, I think both of those should be part of the report. And if, I think Kevin's comments that you dealt with two of the work groups last time, but no votes, okay, whatever we have to do then to structure getting through the other 3 work group recommendations and then get to vote on which of the recommendations will be final that will go in as a panel recommendations, not work group recommendations. I think both would be in there, and I think it would do credit to the panel with the public, because the public can then see how it morphed from the work groups up to the panel, and then the panel's final decision on what was important enough to go forward to the Commonwealth.
I agree. Does anybody disagree with that? Joe?
I do. First of all, I agree with Kurt right out the get-go that we're not in a position to approve recommendations and findings in some areas because frankly, what has been developed by these working groups, with the exception of maybe a couple of groups, the findings don't support the recommendations. They just don't.
But isn't that, Joe, the purpose of the discussion on each one is to determine by the group whether or not it meets that? With you, for example, you have a great deal of expertise in this to say, guys, this just doesn't support it. I really recommend that you don't support this. Isn't that the purpose of that discussion?
Well, it would, but, to include all of the working group's recommendations as kind of raw data is not proper. So I wasn't at the last meeting. I understand there were 2 working groups. The one on PSDAR and decommissioning, I don't think there was any changes between version 1 and version 2. 0. I couldn't find them. I didn't have a red line, but I literally sat side by side with both documents and looked for the changes, and there were none. So my conclusion would be, whatever discussion occurred at the June 7th meeting, they accepted those recommendations in whole, because there were no changes.
I don't believe that's accurate.
That's what I said.
So,
Yeah, that's not accurate.
but there was no changes between version 1 and version 2. So whatever dialogue
But the
occurred.
panel hasn't voted on anything related to it yet.
I understand, but other sections were revised, so I'm assuming that
None was
came out of
voted on that I'm
discussion.
aware of in the minutes. Is that correct?
Correct.
So it's still in the discussion phase, and that's entirely appropriate for you to say, wait a minute, nope. Senator?
I don't know why I feel like I should apologize before I say what I'm about to say, but I'm sorry. Maybe it's the way I was raised. The experts at the table on the subject matter, the only experts, in my humble opinion, there are people who know a lot, but the only experts are employed by Entergy. That's my opinion, okay, having been through the working group process. I think one of the primary functions of this panel is to make sure that there are arm's length experts that are here to benefit the citizens of the Commonwealth that are involved in the process. So that, I'm gonna even take a step back, Sean, and here's what I would rather see as a process, and I'll tell you why. I would almost rather see what we have done go to the interagency working group as a draft of some kind. Have that group engage experts that do not have a financial interest in this to give us feedback on our findings and recommendations. Because then we're going to have experts on behalf of the citizens of the Commonwealth who do not have an economic interest use this as a platform from which to launch their work. I'm really concerned that there's a credibility issue with us. If we present this as findings and recommendations, that one would expect those findings and recommendations to come from people with more of a subject matter expertise than I certainly have. And so that's my concern. I think there's a process here that could get us to what I'm suggesting, that would slow us down a bit, but be more deliberative and perhaps fulfill our mission better on behalf of the citizens. Now, I'll apologize at the end for what I just said also, because I don't want to throw a huge wrench in, because a lot of work has gone on, and I think there's a lot of merit to this. But to release this as a final anything, without the benefit of more subject matter expertise, concerns me.
Concerns noted.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
What you said at the beginning of your comments about, and related to what you said, Joe, about maybe having, excuse me, a few recommendations that we vote on that we can come to a consensus. I think that the committee right now could probably vote on radiation limits and also about the pad. I don't think you need to be subject matter experts to know that. I mean, it just makes sense to move it back farther, the next pad, and that we want the lowest level of radiation possible at the site post-cleanup. So, I mean, that just seems like a no-brainer to me.
So with that,
Mr. Chairman, sorry, I know you don't have counsel whispering in your ear, but the Robert's Rules of Orders is gonna help you down the road. And so I know Paul made a motion. We should probably figure out how to dispense with that motion before moving forward.
absolutely.
But I did want to respond to the good senator's comments,
And
because.
that will be the last before we dispense with your motion. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, sir, with the chair's indulgence. So, I don't often disagree with the good senator, okay, but I think as an individual, as a citizen living close to Pilgrim, with family and all, I look to the state, to the heads of the Department of Public Health, to the heads of the environmental affairs. The state authorities were the ones who decommissioned the Yankee Row industry, at the Yankee Row Power Plant. So similar, okay, and we did not have, to bring in outside experts. We had outside experts. So much we depend on the state and the federal authorities. We either trust them or we don't. And that's my only comment on the good
Is
senator.
that the easiest way to dispose of your motion? Would you like to withdraw it for this evening's purpose?
I think in the interests of efficiency, yes.
Excellent. If that's the case, then we're going to move on to reviewing. The first one is the draft findings and recommendation of the finance and economic one, so we can get into the substantive matter of it. Mr. O'Reilly, as chair, do you mind? Did everybody have a copy of this now?
Are these identical to what was in the
No, totally, there is nothing in here.
There's
This-
nothing-
This is a late entry.
This is
one
a
of the
late
challenges.
entry.
Why are we, can I just ask, why are we gonna now review something none of us have had a chance? I mean, I spent hours going through this but now we're gonna go to something none of us, what, can't we start with something that we've all read and we're prepared to discuss?
I would argue no, and let me explain to you my rationale. I'm open to change. There are two groups that already presented. There are two others we have with us here tonight. So I would like to hear from those two others, and then roll them into the master document again, and do that iterative approach, rather than saying, let's go over everything that's in the master document first, and then deal with the subjects that we haven't even talked about yet. Because that's what my thought would be. Any opinions? I don't know that it's been distributed to the public yet, but you can certainly get a copy. Would you like my copy, Jim? You can certainly,
It needs to be to everybody, if this is not a public process.
as I've explained in the past, and I'd be glad to give you my copy, these are public meetings where we're actually working. They're working groups. It is not for the public necessarily to have the first bite at the apple. We're working on it. Delighted you're here, and delighted to have your input after we go through it, as part of it, before we make any decisions. So, it's an evolving process. I wish it was a lot neater and cleaner, but it isn't. So if you'd like a copy, you can have my copy. Be delighted. So Mr. O'Reilly can begin.
Right.
Kevin?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Finance and Economic Working Group just met prior to this, so there will be a new version of this coming out, but I think the general consensus is that this is a document that we can move forward on. What we did was, we took the activities that had been voted on at our previous meeting, and which are in the report, and attempted to put some meat on the bones of the activities. And the basis for a lot of what we did in this, in our findings and recommendation, come out of the UMass Donahue Institute study that was commissioned by the Old Colony Planning Council, thank you, Pat, and the town of Plymouth back in 2015. And also the draft of the recent RKG report, which was presented at a working meeting to the town about 2 months ago. And also work of the site cleanup and restoration working group, which would be the first subject, and really just trying to be careful not to be duplicative and get into the areas of other working groups. Though, so we just took the finding of that site cleanup and restoration working group and said that the Commonwealth should work with the Department of Energy to determine whether there should be adequate compensation in a form of a host community agreement. That's our first finding and recommendation. Okay.
Are we gonna comment?
Yeah, no, yeah.
That's-
Are
That
there
was
any
my
comments
pregnant
on it?
pause. Yeah.
Any comments on it? Please check.
So we're getting hung up on semantics, I think, with finding, because that has a connotation, and the word recommendation. So what we're doing, we have a mixed panel with limited expertise. I agree with Senator Wolf's statement. There are no epidemiologists on the panel, there are no doctors on the panel, there's no engineering degreed scientists that are on the panel. We have a group of people representing some state agencies. We've got members of the public, we've got appointees from the governor and the government to come together. So rather than, and I take Joe's point as well, you know, we're calling these things a finding which has a connotation to it. What they are really are their observations. We found an observation, an area that we want to have a deeper look at, right? So instead of getting caught up on the, hey, we have these findings, they're basically observations by these subcommittee groups of something that we want to have further discussion about.
And those observations could be provided to the interagency group as a, here's a document created, whatever we call that, through the panel.
Well, let me ask you a question, Jack, just as an open discussion.
Yep.
I'm reading this for the first time myself. I just read the first finding. Does anybody have any quarrel, either at a technical, to the limits of our knowledge, or from a knowledge base of any sort, with any of those three sentences in the findings?
If I
So-
could just add,
I'm
Mr.
just
Mullen,
So the answer is yes.
Okay, that's what we
and,
should be discussing.
But this is gonna start requiring, but I'll just tell you, so, spent nuclear fuel is highly radioactive waste that is dangerous to people and the environment. It is not dangerous, in my opinion, to people and the environment if it is stored appropriately and safely, and, so we need to be very careful. We're telling the public that the spent nuclear fuel that is stored at the plant is dangerous to people and the environment. Well, we have to be much more careful than we are if we're gonna do this in the term of a finding, as opposed, so that's why I'm saying,
But Kurt, it
Words really-
says-
words
but-
really matter
but-
here.
But the comma says, which requires careful storage and management for millennia. I mean, that's what it says.
well, it doesn't say what I'm concerned about, but, so this is why I think these, if we, Jack's point and other points people made, if we're calling these findings, we have to be extremely careful, and we're gonna have to wordsmith these, and you're hearing the lawyer in me perhaps, but if we express these as focal areas of discussion areas, as focal areas, then that's different. A finding just suggests something.
So change the word. Use
Well-
Jack's term of observation, that's fine with me, I don't care.
Yeah, but Kurt's point is there's other words in there. We talked about that last week or 2 weeks ago when we weren't here, about when we're saying things like, the verbs that we use, the action verbs that we use, we should work, or we recommend, or we should engage. That all there's all subtleties into that language. I'm not an attorney, but you understand the point that I'm trying to make. I think we're gonna end up down in the weeds when we should really be doing some broad observations. This is what we saw, this is what we think is a delta, and this is what we think, the working group or somebody should look at.
Mr.
Not
O'Reilly.
Governor Baker, I want you to do this. Enter into negotiations with the Department of Energy on economic impacts for Pilgrim and sign an agreement. That's not the purpose of what we're doing here.
Mr. O'Reilly?
I thought this would be an easy one because I took language out of the, what we talked about last week, so I probably should have put this one down below.
It's a good starting
It's a
point,
good
really.
start.
I mean, we're trying to figure out how are we gonna get to an endpoint, and we are gonna have some painful machinations as we work through.
That's
How
the
how do
nature.
we present this?
Next one, Mr. O'Reilly?
So, under workforce training
But
needs,
we didn't discuss
I'm
the
sorry.
recommendation.
oh, okay, go
So-
ahead. Yeah, sorry.
You're gonna hear me say over and over again, and this is creating a lot of angst above me, these drafts that the Commonwealth should. If the working group or the panel has a recommendation, let's say it that way. So if the panel recommends that the Department of Energy determine adequate compensation, let's do that, but I don't think we should be,
Prescribed.
80% of these say the Commonwealth should, the Commonwealth should.
Passive language.
We're asking the Commonwealth to do something with the Department of Energy, but you have not heard from the Commonwealth. The Commonwealth may have different opinions, Commonwealth may not have any authority here.
I have to absolutely, I'm sorry to interrupt, Kurt, but I have to absolutely disagree. Go back to the legislation, Senator. We are a citizens advisory panel. We are not the Commonwealth. We are here to give our best judgment after learning as much as we can, and there are going to be occasions, if we put this to a vote right now, and we pass it, and nobody would disagree, that we have to be careful about the way we word things. But we're a citizens advisory panel. We are not a group of scientists or engineers. We're doing the best we can with the information that we've received, and that kind of input, to make sure that we say it properly, is important. But I think we're picking around the edges of it. I really do. And I don't know how everybody else feels, but we want to be as right as we possibly can. We want to be as rational and as careful as we possibly can, but we want to be clear. So that's just my thought on it. We're a
So-
citizens advisory.
So you apologize for interrupting, but I wasn't done. So,
I'm sorry.
So concern number one is, I think this recommendation should start off, the panel recommends, and what is it we're recommending, not be continually telling the Commonwealth, you should do this, you should do that. So it should be the panel recommends. Now, then it goes on to say that the Department of Energy determine adequate compensation for whom? I'm not sure what in the form of a host community agreement. So are we compensating Plymouth?
Yes.
That's what it
Yeah,
says.
that's what it says.
Well, okay, well, it doesn't, if I'm asking the question,
Yeah,
it's because
yeah.
I'm not sure, it doesn't say,
That's what it says to me.
determine adequate compensation, then it should say for the town of Plymouth,
Sure.
if that's what, I'm just
Yeah,
asking the
Yeah,
question.
that's fine.
I'm not sure, again, I think we're getting beyond sort of focusing on the decommissioning issues of this plant. but,
I absolutely disagree.
So,
Absolutely disagree. This is,
That's-
I hadn't seen this till this evening. This is exactly the kind of thing that we should be saying. That either we agree as a panel that the town of Plymouth should be compensated for being a long-term de facto nuclear waste site, or we don't agree with that. One or the other. It's simple, in my opinion. And that's why we can vote next month on who the chairs are again. And if you like me at all, please release me from this burden. Anyway, so, any more
I stand in
discussion?
agreement with Chair Mullen here on this thing.
Sure.
I think that, I think that wordsmithing is important. I think the experience that we had in our site cleanup and restoration working group was that I made a draft that had a lot of burdensome language in it. And that through the course of our meeting, we trimmed it completely to the point where everybody could agree. And that's how we got there as a group of Entergy and state and citizen working in the same room, trying to, put the problem that we have into common parlance. We're not pretending to be experts. We're only saying that with the Entergy and the unions and the citizen that's the pain in the neck, we can agree on these things, and we can agree on this language. It probably needs better language yet, but that's our offering to the governor. This is after, as you said, after 7 or 8 months of banging our heads and trying to really come to terms with the problem, this is what we can tell you, Governor.
I'd just offer one thought. Having worked with Kurt now for a year and most closely over the last couple of months, no one is better at developing consensus-based wordsmithing than Kurt. So I would encourage you, my friend, to work out language that you think would be workable for everybody. I don't think anybody's wed to this, are they? Mr. Selectman,
I was glad to see it.
Mr. Selectman.
Just something else. So when the plan first came to town, and I've heard this from numerous people, obviously promises were made at the federal level. Don't worry about the spent fuel. We're going to take care of it. I think somewhere that promise went south in the early 80s. And to Chair Mullen's comment a few minutes ago, the town of Plymouth is and has been for a long time a de facto nuclear waste dump, and our compensation is zero. So what we struggle with at the local level is Charlie Baker or Karen Polito or somebody at the state level, they carry more weight if they go to the federal delegation or get down to DC and say, this community needs your help. We're just a local executive board that really, outside of the NRC or the federal bureaucracy, we really have no control. And you're just asking for help. So I don't know what the wording is, but this is an issue. It's going to be an issue for decades, if not centuries. And how do you communicate that to the state partners and have them advocate for us down in DC for some sort of level of compensation? And I know there's some people in the room that believe the compensation should come from Entergy, and ultimately, you know, our federal partners dropped the ball 35 years ago and continue to do so. But there's a situation here that universally agreed locally is that, you know, the town of Plymouth is holding the bag, and that's wrong. So
Not just the town of Plymouth.
I'm not married to this sentence here under recommendations, but any improvement, I'd be willing to consider.
Jack?
John, I think you're correct. So, Kurt, you know, I'm trying to say this politically correct, no. We have to be careful about the words we select and we use when we're communicating. In my position in the Department of Public Health for RAD control, every word is scrutinized when we put a document together. So I think we would be efficient in our use of time if we look at the finding and the recommendations and just say that that's something we want to keep and we want to move up. And then we can figure out the correct words for it. For example, okay, so my first draft, when I would look at that, and I am selecting active verbs, not passive verbs, the panel recommends a method to determine adequate compensation in the form of a host community agreement for the long-term storage of spent fuel pool is required.
That's fine by
Right?
me.
Not the Commonwealth, not the Department of Energy. We just recognize that there's an issue that we understand, and in the finding, I would just say, as determined by the site cleanup and restoration work group, spent nuclear fuel requires careful storage management. That's a fact.
That's fine.
It's not subjective. I don't get into whether it's dangerous and things like that. So for the use of our time, because we will never get through all of these recommendations in a 2-hour time period.
Won't happen.
But if we just look at the subjects that the panel's brought up as an observation and say, yes, we think that that's something we could pursue, then we can work on our wordsmithing and come back in the draft.
Let me, I don't think anybody would disagree with that, Jack.
So I'll put a motion on the floor that we go through these findings and recommendations and make a upvote or downvote of whether we want to move it forward, and then we will wordsmith it in the draft, and then we can come back with the wordsmith and make a vote on them.
I second that motion.
A point, don't think we should say the panel. I think the working group is what we're getting out of this. Only the working group is making this recommendation. We can decide later on whether or not we want to bring it into the panel.
But that's why I thought about, we would determine that we want to move it forward as a panel, because the wording in the final document is going to be the panel recommends, not the working group.
Discussion, Joe?
Along the lines of what Jack said, I agree. I think in order for us to get through all this, I think what would be wise is, building on what Jack said, is if we take a sense of the panel, a vote, whatever, on each of the column, whatever you want, or observations, I don't care what terms you use, but vote on them as a concept, not the wording, okay?
Right.
And if we agree that the concept is worthy of moving forward on, then what I think the panel needs to do is to pick a smaller group, 2 or 3 people, probably at the max, to then deal with. I agree with Kurt, I agree with Jack, having spent my career in government, the sensitivity of words is very, very important in moving forward. Well, if the 2 or 3 people, let's say the panel agreed to then pick to do the final wordsmithing of what would put the panel in the best light. I'm not talking about looking good. I'm talking about keeping the substance of each item that we agree needs to move forward, but doing it in such a manner that it's likely to get more resonance when it's received on Beacon Hill. If those folks, be it Kurt, be it Jack, be it one or two others, maybe Dan also, if they, having dealt with this sort of stuff in the past, can wordsmith these ones we want to go forward with, and in the end, that wording is not offensive to those who are receiving it on the other end, and they really focus on the substance of it, I think we've really accomplished a lot. And I, for one,
We have a
I
motion on
don't
the
care
floor.
how it's wordsmithed. I'd turn that over to a little subgroup of quote experts to schmooze the wording in whatever way I think is determined to be the best way to move forward.
We have a motion on the floor. No further debate on the motion at the moment. Motion was seconded. All in favor and by a voice vote of each individual. Sign with you, Pat.
What do we vote
So
on?
we're voting
Repeat the
on-
motion.
The
Jack's
motion on the,
motion.
so the motion that I made was that we would go through these findings and recommendations and look at the gist or the.
An up or down?
The base, up or down, whether we want to move it forward and then wordsmith it.
Right, that's the motion on the floor. Seconded by co-chair Kurt Schwartz.
Yes.
Yes.
Abstain?
Yes.
Yes. Yes.
My concern, Sean, I mentioned this,
Yeah.
I mentioned this last week, a lot of you weren't here, but I think it's kind of consistent with Kurt had mentioned earlier. Any recommendation that we do make, I think it needs to be backed by some evidence or substance, like, I think the senator said earlier that, other than a couple of people here, that none of us are experts, so, we've had some experts come in and talk to us. They've been there, it's what they do. It's really not what we do. So what I find lacking here is that, and I think it comes from all my years at the DPU, when we issue an order, we have to, every order that goes out is heavily scrutinized. We get, we make citations to where we got, why we're saying this, what's backing it up, what's the evidence, what's the substance. And I just think that this report here, this draft needs a little bit more of that, because we do lack the expertise. So to move along, I'm going to abstain as well.
Okay. Abstain. Kurt?
Yes.
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 No. Yes.
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 No, okay, and I believe I have to explain with the chair's indulgence, I've been snookered, okay, because this is what I wanted to do with the site cleanup, so no.
Joe?
Abstain.
Sure.
Sure, I guess that's mischief abounds. All right, so with that, then what I'd like to suggest we do is starting with this one we're working with right now, only for the purposes of a straight up or down. Let's take the recommendation, Kevin's had a chance to explain the first one, and let's deal with that one, then we'll go on to the second one, and we'll start this process and try to be as expeditious as we can. So on the first recommendation, is there a motion on the floor to vote it up or down?
Mr. Mullen,
Yes.
could we make the motion based on the revised language? I think that's better language
Okay.
that Jack came up with.
Jack, do you have the language?
I do. Would you like me to read it for the record?
Please.
As determined by the Site Cleanup and Restoration Working Group, spent nuclear fuel requires careful storage management. To date, the Department of Energy has not determined interim or long-term storage options available for the waste at Pilgrim. In addition, the Finance and Economic Working Group also finds that little information exists regarding the economic impacts of indefinitely storing spent fuel in a community.
Okay,
Any comments? Okay,
that's it.
and then the recommendation, the panel recommends a method to determine adequate compensation in the form of a host community agreement for the long-term storage of spent fuel is required.
Could you read that one again, Jack?
I think I messed that up. The panel recommends a method to determine adequate compensation in the form of a host community group agreement for the long-term storage of the spent fuel.
See,
One more
I just can't help but feel that what we're doing, by doing the language at the same time we're doing the concept,
So we're asking
gonna get us
for,
bogged down.
right, so I provided that language to clarify what the subject
Is,
matter is. And we're making a vote on, we recognize that, and the storage working group found that little information exists regarding the economic impact
I
of
think the
indefinitely
finding, I
storing.
think the finding's a lot easier than the recommendation. To,
No.
Kevin?
I think the recommendation as put forward is pretty straightforward, which is, do we want to pursue finding compensation to the town of Plymouth in the form of a host community agreement?
Straight.
I think that's
That's
really,
it, that's it.
that's it. That's the concept.
That's the
Concept, right.
concept. So on that, is there a motion to move both the finding and the concept for an up or down to move forward with this?
So moved.
Second. All in favor, say aye. Aye. Opposed? Passes. Kevin, workforce training needs.
Workforce training, again, this is based on, actually, there were some expert subject matter here, and that was the UMass Institute that produced the report, which is available on the town's website, and presented that report in May of 2015 regarding both the workforce needs of Pilgrim Nuclear Power Station employees and secondary businesses that may be impacted. During our working group meeting, Joe pointed out that Entergy has already jumped out on front of this and is working with agencies and thinking about what's going to happen with their employees down the road. But we did feel that with secondary impacts as well, and those employees who either choose not to take a position at another Entergy facility for whatever reason, that may need some workforce training. And simply all we're asking is that, and we can, the concept is that we should ask the Commonwealth to start looking at workforce training programs in industries, and also work with local entities such as the local chambers of commerce. Dave pointed out that we should also include vocational training for high school students. So that's the concept. There should be adequate thought given to workforce training for both employees and secondary businesses that will be impacted by the closing.
Any discussion?
I have some wording selection for the recommendation.
Joe, let's go with you first, since,
Thank you. Kevin mentioned it, but we've already started the process, and I think if you were to be provided a presentation or a summary of what we've already engaged in our plan going forward, you may find that it's exactly what we're doing, minus the part that he had mentioned about the secondary impacts on local businesses and things like that. But as far as employees' engagement with the state agencies, it's already been going on for about 6 months and will continue, through shutdown. So I just wanted to make sure people understood that. If we approach agencies and say, we need your help for finding people jobs and retraining, they're gonna go, we've been working on it for 6 months.
Yeah.
Thank you very much for the recommendation.
any others, before we get to the wording? Yes, Selectman.
Just, we've got 4 more categories here, and I'm just going to make a blanket comment with respect to all 4 of them, so in the interest of time. So we're hearing experts all the time. So this economic development, the community of Plymouth for decades has been a perpetual state of what do we need to do for economic development? And we have had the experts come in. The University of Massachusetts did a top-to-bottom evaluation. Barry Bluestone from Northeastern University came into the Board of Selectmen a year or 2 ago. They did a top-to-bottom 2-year evaluation of the entire process of how economic development is done in the town of Plymouth. We came out with an A-. The RKG report, and that's only in the last 5 years. There's report after report after report from experts out there. And all of this is just, borderline redundant statement of facts, and all this stuff is, you know, obviously it's pretty straightforward and, you know, no-brainers, but I just wanted you to know that, obviously, the impact of this plan had something that nobody could have foreseen in the 70s and 80s, which was instantaneously adding 30,000 people to the community. And what happened was, and I've talked to people who preceded me on the Board of Selectmen in the 80s and 90s, they've always been in a perpetual state of, where do we get more revenue to quote-unquote replace this existing revenue? So I just wanted to let you know that the experts have vetted this from top to bottom for decades, and there's really nothing here that should surprise anybody.
Any other discussion before we hear Jack's? Yes, Dave.
Mr. Chair, I would just add, you know, I think that when the work group was discussing this, we looked at not only the workforce training needs of the current employees of Plymouth, of the power station, which is important, but also it's an opportunity for us to talk about what the workforce needs are for future industries that might want to locate in Plymouth and take up the opportunity to, you know, create another industrial base that's beyond what the power station creates. So I think John's right, the town's doing this, and this is just an area for us to emphasize to the state that it's also important for us to think about what the next generation of Plymouth is gonna look like.
Jack, do you have
I do. So the concept is that the closing of the plant is going to have an impact on the workers at the plant and secondary businesses beyond the plant.
Correct.
Okay, so that's the finding or observation. So rather than say the Commonwealth, I would say the panel recognizes that workforce training programs can assist PNPS employees and employees from secondary industries who will be impacted by the closure. Local higher education institutions through the Plymouth Area Chamber of Commerce, Higher Education Leadership Council can identify and create additional education opportunities.
Is there a motion to move this forward for further consideration?
I'll make a motion.
Second?
Second.
Second. All in favor? You want to do it by voice, or do you want to do it? Voice should be. Voices. All right.
By voice.
All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
All opposed? It moves forward.
Okay, thank you.
Kevin?
So moving along, again, the economic impacts were taken directly out of the UMass report. So these numbers are pretty straightforward. This again goes back to 2015, and I guess to summarize, and we did introduce the interagency working group here, but we can make a broader statement that really gets down to the last sentence, that analysis and research needs to include impact of property values and source of spent fuelage on site. And prior to that sentence, should research and do research and analysis on direct and indirect economic impacts to the region and provide guidance and assistance.
Any discussion on either the findings or the recommendation?
I would suggest, instead of saying overcome, I would say the panel recognizes these economic impacts.
And again, you know, creating the revised language is something that, Jack, if you don't mind helping us with, that would be great. But again, the concept of the finding and the recommendation, any discussion on it?
The only comment I have is that I worry about limiting it to the town of Plymouth. Because plant employees work in other towns. If there's a disaster, it's gonna affect all the other towns. There are businesses in other towns that support it. So it concerns me that it's limited to the town.
Well, to that point, we do say the economic impact to the region.
In the last sentence.
In the second to the last sentence.
Okay.
In the findings, to your point.
Any further discussion? Hearing none, is there a motion to move this forward?
Make a motion to move it forward.
Pat, second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Passes. Next one, Kevin.
Okay.
Economic development challenges and
Challenges.
opportunities.
Again, this information, the finding, came from information that was provided to us, to the town of Plymouth from our colleagues in Vermont. And the recommendation simply is that we need to begin planning now on how to assist the region in creating new economic development opportunities. We don't put a price tag on it or anything, but that's the overall aspect of that finding and recommendation.
Yes, Jack. Oh, Joe, let me let you go first.
Sure.
Yes. Joe.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to make a clarification that the information contained in here about Vermont Yankee has nothing to do with Entergy supporting the economic development of the region because of decommissioning. It was part of a settlement agreement between the state and Entergy to allow the plant to operate through 2014. And these were the payments that were agreed to as part of that. So I'm not sure it's the proper example to say that's the reason why things should be the same here or considered, you know, in and around Plymouth, because it's apples and oranges. So I would not reference Vermont Yankee as the basis or the data to support the finding and therefore the recommendation, because they're not the same.
Good. Did you?
I had a question, but I can.
Go ahead, Paul.
There was a point of information that on the town's Nuclear Matters Committee, having served with Mr. Mahoney, we looked at this, these millions of dollars, and they were actually taken from the decommissioning trust fund. So de facto, we looked at it as a siphoning of funds that should have gone to the town or should have gone to the site cleanup. So we questioned it at that time. Did the subcommittee view it differently, or, I mean, it sounds nice to give away money, but, yeah.
Well, go ahead, John.
I think that data is just put there, Paul, just to kind of reflect what occurred in Vermont.
Yes, I
And-
agree. But it
And
went
it's-
to the state.
and not necessarily implying that something like that would happen here. I mean, everything is subject to negotiation.
Okay.
Maybe does,
All right, I can
Mr.
agree
Priest
with
has some
that.
language to
No,
reflect that?
actually, just discussing that with Kevin, I think that's, I think this finding and recommendation is a duplicate of the preceding recommendation, where we recognize as a concept that we need economic assistance, and this is the cost and the impact. So we may be able to move some of that information that's in the finding up to the preceding recommendation and finding and consolidate those two.
I think we're fine with that. We can discuss moving.
But I was asking the same question, because the finding seems to want to focus on Entergy, but the recommendation does not, so they don't go together. So I do think, and for that reason, I thought the recommendation is duplicative of one above it.
So we can
So-
defer this one.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you want to just
We'll move on.
defer it?
Yep.
Okay. Any disagreement or discussion on deferring this one? Just to make.
For the whole, that whole?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, because I have a concern about one of the things in it.
Okay. Any other further discussion on that, or we'll just defer it without a vote?
I would just vote, I would vote
Table.
that we would.
Just make a motion to table that.
Okay.
Second.
All in favor? Aye. Opposed?
Okay, and the last one is regarding land use, and this really is Plymouth-specific. Again, the findings come directly out of the draft RKG report, which was commissioned by the town of Plymouth and the Plymouth Regional Economic Development Foundation. And I guess the gist of the recommendation is that we need to find, identify areas of consensus between the landowner, the town of Plymouth, regarding any future development activities, and get assistance to securing developable acreage to ensure future development and economic development opportunities in the area. This is a discussion that is hot and heavy in Plymouth right now. There's a lot of competing interest in if what could happen on the property. It's really not our decision right now. As Joe pointed out, it's under Chapter 61 right now until 2022. Plymouth does have the right of first refusal if they take it out of Chapter 61, but everyone in Plymouth knows that we don't have the funding right now to do anything with that right of first refusal. So I think this is an acknowledgement that there's a huge tract of land that may become available in the community, and we need to plan for that.
Any discussion?
Yes.
Selectmen?
Well, I would, Kevin, I would disagree with the statement that the town doesn't have the wherewithal to secure this property if it were to come on the market. So there are
Okay.
things going on that haven't become out public, so all you can do is try to position the community to react if and when the opportunity arises.
Is there any other discussion on it, Joe?
Yeah, I have a concern. I mean, I certainly support the concept because I've worked with the town and the entity work group and other entities that we need to pursue all kinds of economic development options. However, the statement that the Commonwealth should assist to secure developable acreage, I'm concerned with that because it seems to put the Commonwealth in a box.
We have some words for you.
And I don't think that's right. I think we should wordsmith it
I
to be
think,
different than we want the Commonwealth to support economic development efforts, but to pin them down to
To your
assist in
point,
securing
again,
acreage, I don't think that's
is,
right.
again, because we're talking concepts here rather than specifics, I think if we take the sentence beginning with future development and keep that as a concept for moving forward, then we can,
Yeah.
for the sake of moving this thing along, I
Yeah.
think I would ask you to support that concepts and acknowledge the importance to the community, and we can wordsmith later.
Is there a motion then?
I'll make that motion.
So the motion is to strike into the recommendations that you would strike the words preceding future. So
Those-
potential verbiage would say, the panel recognizes future development is dependent on zoning changes within the community, which would be obtained through the town meeting. This land, if deemed developable, is a significant economic driver of the region as identified by RKJ Associates, Inc.
Generally, that's the language. I mean,
The general
That's the
concept
gist.
language.
Right.
Yep.
still the same motion?
Yes.
Is there a second?
Second.
Any discussion on the motion?
I was just seconding.
All right. Any discussion on the motion? All in favor? Aye. Any opposed?
I'm going to abstain.
One abstention. Joe? Two abstains? Okay. Joe and John abstained, Ellen? Anybody else want to note an abstention? Okay. Hearing none? This new approach might be worthwhile.
So can I just ask a question, having not been here last week? Should we do the same thing for what you did last week, or, and quickly go through, or is the consensus of everybody here last week that all of the recommendations that you all looked at should go forward and they just have to be wordsmith?
I think, again, for efficiency, we had a lot of discussion last week, we talked about words, I don't think we came to a consensus. I would recommend, as we just did with this, we go back to the draft two
Yeah.
and work our way through the recommendations, as many as we can get into.
I agree, and I think that's a great idea. Joseph, do you want to do anything with yours to begin with, or do you want to put that behind working through the
More than one page, though?
It ended up, all we have is one page that ends up with the word standard.
Yeah, I don't think we got the,
No.
This was the activities that was missing.
That is simply a handout for populating the activities
Okay.
category
That's
goes
fine.
in.
of the report.
Got
If you
it.
The
could send it
report
elect-
contains
you could send it
all of the
elect-
10 findings and recommendations
All right.
we sent in months ago.
Then let's turn to the report.
What page?
I'm gonna pick, well, you might be looking at a different version. Are you looking at version 2? Did you print
Page
version 2?
10, I think it starts on.
9?
9, begins on
Is it?
page 9. Thank you, Mary.
Okay.
Page 9.
Page 10, but that's
Yeah.
okay. PSDAI.
Which one?
2, but that's all right.
Yeah, it
Just
is.
the way it was printed.
Mine says 9.
It's in the front, but- Okay.
That's weird. Might be between the two
Right.
systems. All right, taking up PSDAR and Decommissioning Working Group. Joseph, do you want to take it away just like Kevin did?
I'll try. This has been an issue that's been debated a lot, about the numerical number of millirems that should be adopted, if you will, in the different numbers have been floated from 25 to those that were adopted in Vermont, which was significantly less. The recommendation was that the Commonwealth consider adopting a standard of less than 10 millirems. That's the concept.
Okay, any discussion on it?
Yeah.
Yes,
Paul?
yes. I would recommend that you consider on the site cleanup and restoration, okay, the work by Ms. Dubois, okay, as to the wording, because it goes directly to the wording. I don't think it changes the concept of the
back, Joe.
the millirem allowed per year, and the recommendation, the finding and the recommendation. That's why, that was the source of my original motion,
So-
was that the wording was so much better.
So you can make a motion to strike this finding or recommendation from here, and we'll address it in the site cleanup section with the appropriate language.
I'd agree with that.
It's fine. Fine with me.
Or you can
Any
just table
other
it and then move
discussion on
on
it?
and address it when you do the
Right.
sites.
Okay,
Either way,
so
trying to
just,
process.
just phrase the motion so that Alan can get it down.
Okay.
To strike from
So
this.
my motion is to remove the language under the PSDAR and decommissioning working group, and the residual radioactivity will be addressed in the site cleanup and restoration section.
Is there a second?
I'll
Second.
second it.
Kevin, Paul, second.
Yes, sir.
Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none, all in favor?
Aye.
All opposed? Any abstentions? So it's stricken from here and will be put into the safety section. Next, Joe.
Site cleanup.
Site cleanup, rather. Site cleanup.
Can I ask, just in the interest of moving things along, does this, I believe this next one was also dealt with in safety and security, is that right? It would seem to me that a discussion about whether the EPZ continues or not should be in the safety and, under safety and security, and also not under PSDA or decommissioning.
Can I just ask a question relative to this?
Sure.
I think our thinking in PSDAR was to try and get these things in the PSDAR as it's written. So I think that was the point, both on the first one and on this, in terms of having something there. So if there's something in the panel's recommendation that would cover that base, I think we'd be all set with that.
But the
The EPZ and the.
Right,
and
but the template for PSDAR, that's not addressed in there, and you couldn't
Right,
force somebody to do that.
Right.
got you.
So, but we could address it.
In
The other
safety,
section.
Right, but we took, to build on what Pine said, we took the approach
Yep.
with the work group that the PSDAR is a broad
And I-
overreach for the entire process. And so yes, we would agree. We wanted to get as many of the concepts and issues in there as we believed necessary. But if any of the other work groups were more specifically focused on them and had more expertise, that's fine. We just didn't want the issues not to surface in the overall process.
Understand?
so that when we get to the EPZ, do we want to do the same effort that we just did to put that into the other location?
So we have a motion on the floor.
Yeah.
to
I would
move
make
this.
a motion to withdraw or delete this from this section and to deal with it under safety and security.
Is there a second to that motion?
Second.
Any discussion on that motion? Hearing none, all in favor? Aye. Opposed? Any abstentions? None. Joseph?
On a roll. Decommissioning option. We had indicated, which is just pretty straightforward, there are three options for it. The safe store, decon and tomb, and we recommended that, to encourage entity to adopt a more rapid decommissioning as the option for their decommissioning of Pilgrim, in light of the environmental and security threats of the environment, et cetera, et cetera. So what we're basically saying is, so far, publicly, Entergy has stated they're probably gonna head with, or use Safe Store as their decommissioning option. We're saying we would like to encourage them to do a rapid decommissioning, not use the entire time frame that Safe Store allows.
I think we got the
That's
concept.
the concept.
Any discussion on it?
Yes.
Joe?
Well, first of all, Entry has not made any statement regarding whether we're choosing Decon or Safe Store publicly, so that statement would need to be removed. Second, the decision whether to go to any of the options is based on a long list of criteria, and I'm not even sure if, environmental impacts is one of them. So it's primarily driven by whether there's enough money in the fund to be able to go with immediate decommissioning versus Safe Store. That'll be the most significant driver, and then there's other criteria. So I think the basis for why you would recommend expedited decommissioning is not supported by the finding.
Well, I recall you personally making the statement that Entergy was leaning towards the Safe Store option. So, as far as I'm concerned, it is accurate, what I said.
Okay, well, we can check the record, but I could lose my job for saying something that's not accurate, so I stand behind the fact
You
that we
didn't
have
say
not
they
made a
made a
statement.
decision, you said they were leaning in that direction.
Can I-
Please, Paul?
Yes, it's said much shorter, more efficiently in the site cleanup and restoration. I would suggest you drop that wording, and we can get out of this discussion, which,
What was that again, Paul?
that the same recommendation, de facto, to, that we encourage the licensee to go to a rapid decommissioning. I think it's said more succinctly and without the discussion in the site restoration and cleanup.
Jack's going to give us the answer on this. So I think in the finding area, so I do believe this decommissioning option should be part of the PSDAR. So I think it
I
should
think
stay,
so- I
because
think so, too.
that's kind of the basis of what you
Yeah.
put
I
that
agree.
document together for.
Okay,
So I agree with Joe. I think that's
Which-
kind of a
which Joe?
Joe Lynch, that statement, I would recommend that statement be removed from the finding section, that sentence, energy is indicated. We haven't gotten anything formal. We may have had a discussion, and short of going back and pulling the records to see whether it's factual or not, it really doesn't add any value to what we are trying to accomplish. The concept is that there's three methodologies for where that plant could end up. And we want the panel, so I changed the recommendation to say, the panel recommends to the interagency working group to evaluate rapid decommissioning as the option for decommissioning.
I think that's decent wording for getting us moving through this thing. I'd like to kill the discussion on it now if there's no real adamant and move it to, are we moving this forward? I agree personally that it should stay within the PSDAR and not, can be duplicated. So is there a motion to move this forward? Second? Second. Any discussion on the motion? Hearing none,
Yeah,
all in
and that-
favor? I'm sorry.
And
No.
the comments, I agree with Paul's comment, and I agree with Jack's comments on the wordings and so forth, that's fine.
So, any, all in favor?
Aye.
Any opposed? Any abstentions? Joe Lynch abstains. Any other abstentions? John? No? Okay. So this one moves forward. God bless you. Joseph?
Let's see. The decommissioning oversight.
Can I make a suggestion? Try to, in the interest of efficiency, I believe that one of the 4 recommendations the panel has already agreed to speaks to this issue. And this recommendation and finding are very vague. So I think it's duplicative of something as a panel we've already said, if we look back to the 4. So I think we've already done it as a full panel. So I don't think it's necessary to do it again here. That's my suggestion.
Is there a motion or any discussion on
Well,
this?
I'll move to spark a discussion if there is one. So I so
Yeah.
move to withdraw.
Okay,
Any second?
no, I'd like to discuss.
Please.
As I read it, so this would apply to all nuclear power systems within the Commonwealth's borders? I mean, this would be retroactive, retrospective, DPU would get involved if.
No, we
we're gonna
motion
be-
to strike it. His motion is to strike that section.
So I agree with you. It's too broad as written.
Strike it.
Basically.
So you and I agree then?
Yes.
Okay,
It's
good.
too broad, and I think it ought to be,
It took a while.
the panel's already dealt with, I
Need
think.
some more mountain.
So is there a second on this motion?
I'm getting
David
late.
seconds. Any more discussion on seconds? All in favor? Aye.
Aye.
All opposed? Any abstentions?
Keep you honest.
Hearing none.
The pad location.
Yes.
The next one. The recommendation is that the Commonwealth encourage NRC to require energy to use the most current and accepted by the NRC flooding information. We understand that, I know Joe has mentioned in presentations that they're constantly working with updating the data that they use and so forth, and this was to reinforce that concept, because it's certainly come up very often in the discussion, whether it's because of sea level rise concerns, not getting into the political argument of what's causing it or any of that sort of stuff, but nonetheless, due to the exposure, coastal exposure and so forth, that the most current data be utilized. The concept is to use the most current data in the location of the pad, the new pad.
Any
Would we
discussion
wanna-
on the concept?
Would we want to have that in the safety and security section rather than the PSDAR section?
I think it's in
Again,
the
it's
site
not
cleanup section.
that
as
the
well.
location of that pad is not necessarily part of the PSDAR.
Right, I agree.
Yeah.
So, but it is
But should it
it's
be
a
in
point that
site
we want to
cleanup?
have a discussion, and we'll move it to the safety section and then figure out the
And
words.
it is in the site cleanup, that whole
Right.
climate changey thing.
Okay.
Is there a motion to move this?
Yeah, do the
Yes,
discussion.
David?
Mr.
Yeah.
I mean, I just wonder if we shouldn't, in concept, go a little further here. And, I mean, it's great to use all the data, but I think that the panel might also want to think about recommending that it be put as far away from the coast as possible. And so we don't just want the data, but we want the data to hopefully reflect a concept of moving this thing further away from the coast than it currently is.
And that really, Dave, I think is the challenge of trying to both do the wordsmithing and the concept at the same time.
So that's going to be, so that's another highly
Absolutely.
technical area that's outside, not to offend anyone, but it's outside the expertise of the people that are at this panel. So that's a good one that you would make a recommendation, I think, to the working group to go to the interagency group to get expertise to come in and say, what is the
Where does it go in the
optimal
Commonwealth?
location for that pad?
Yeah.
In
Yeah, I
the
don't think we need to
Commonwealth?
pick where the pad
Right.
goes, but just the sentiment to
The
the committee
concept
that,
that,
move it away from the coast.
I think it might be helpful along those lines. I think Joe has mentioned pretty clearly in some presentations in the past, both to the Entergy Work Group and I think here, that their technical people, their engineers and geologists and so forth and so on, are doing that kind of analysis I'm not trying to take their position, I'm just trying to repeat what I have heard them say before, and maybe if it would be helpful to have another presentation on where they are in doing that research for, not only for flood exposure purposes, but seismological purposes and soil compaction and all of that sort of stuff, which Joe has gone over in the past, but maybe an update on where they are on their findings, because it's very important as to where that second pad is going to be located, and if the presentation achieves a comfort level of the panel, that they're doing enough, or that more needs to be done, whatever it is, then go from there. But I
Let's-
think in fairness to them, if they can just give us an update at some
For
point.
the, and absolutely, Joe, but for the purposes of expediting our consideration of this, is there a motion to move this forward, either here or in one other section for further consideration?
Should be.
Yes.
I'll make a motion to move it
See,
forward.
I thought you were considering moving it to safety and security.
That's fine. I hadn't heard a motion on that yet, so move it to
I so
safety.
moved it,
Okay.
yeah.
Is there a second on that?
Aye.
Paul, any discussion on the motion? Hearing none? All in favor?
Aye.
All against? Any abstentions? Move it through. Okay. Joseph?
PSDI submission and public meeting timing. Some of these now, I think the remainder of them are largely coming from the review of the NRC documents, of the, what do they call it, the regulatory basis analysis and so forth and so on, those two documents. And we had decided that there were enough substantive issues in those two reports, and they're gonna be coming out with a notice of proposed rulemaking probably at the end of this year on all of that, that we would include a number of those because of the importance of what we thought the importance of them were, so that if the panel decided to go forward with any of them, at least it would give a sense to the NRC on those kinds of issues as to what the panel and the Commonwealth may be thinking.
Would it be better, Joe,
Because
to-
they haven't finalized them yet.
Would it be better, Joe, to take that up separately and unbundle these and have the panel vote on drafting something directly to express our opinions, rather than putting this in our report?
It will have that opportunity, I believe, if the NRC comes out with the notice of proposed rulemaking towards the end of this year at some point in time. Then if the panel wants to review that document, as I've said in the past, and then come up with its own recommendations on, what's in that particular notice of proposed rulemaking, fine. We've just never discussed it other than it's coming.
This could be, so the next three findings could be a topic for year 2 for the panel, because we don't know what the final rules would be, and we would have an opportunity for the public to provide input on the change in the
Yes.
rules when they
Yes,
publish it
Jack,
in the,
I agree.
so.
Is there a motion to do that? To defer these until year 2 of the panel's meetings for discussion?
I'd be willing to
Motion?
make that motion.
We should be more specific on which ones,
So it's the PSDA submission and public timing,
right?
it's the review and approval by the NRC,
Yep.
it's the decommissioning financial protection plans, and it's
I'm not sure if the next
the
one,
one.
the decommissioning trust fund, falls under that rule change.
Yeah, the financial protection plans and the trust fund are both mentioned in those NRC documents. But even if they don't make any changes, we believe those are relevant issues that in one way or another, we probably would be wise to take some sort of a position on them, because they're very, very important from a financial and economic
So
standpoint.
do you want to just consider moving out the first two that I read?
First three,
I would think it was three, Sean.
Yeah,
So the motion is to move the PSDAR submission and public meeting timing, PSDR review and approval by the NRC, and the decommissioning financial protection plans to year 2, and then we'll stop there. That's the
Leave that
motion.
for the moment. Is that,
But does emergency preparedness fall in the same category? It seems to me you're trying to anticipate.
let's hit at least first three, and then we'll do that one next.
All right, that's fine.
Pine, did you make a motion?
That was a motion, and yes, I concur with those three.
Was there a second? Paul? Any discussion on the motion?
I just have a point of,
Yeah.
a question, I guess, because the submission and public meeting timing recommendation talks about our
Two.
desire to have it filed 6 months prior to shutdown. If we defer this to year 2, when we write a report in June of
Yeah, that's
2019,
Right.
it will already be irrelevant. And so I think if we want to convey the concept of putting forward a PSDAR for public comment 6 months before shutdown, we can't wait until year 2 of the panel's report, because we'll already be past that point.
I think we could invite Entergy to come in and speak to the progress of the PSDAR and maybe a projected timeline. I wouldn't ask them in this meeting to commit to a timeline, but
If I could make a comment, it's difficult to write a plan about decommissioning that includes the historical spills, events on the site if you still have 6 months of operational
right.
period. So that's the reason you submit it just before you shut down, so that you capture everything.
Any further discussion on this? Because David's point's well taken, I think, but I'm not sure we want to, well, just on that one topic. What's folks feeling about that?
but Joe, also, question, doesn't, according to the NRC, doesn't the licensee have actually up to 2 years after the shutdown to actually file it?
That's correct. You can file it early, but, you may have to change it.
Yeah.
And then you can file it up to 2 years after you shut down.
And, I mean, the point you raised is a fair point. I think our point was, we don't want it to take 2 years after the shutdown for the PSDAR to be submitted. We would like it done before then, whatever time frame becomes more appropriate, but certainly not the full 2 years.
Would anybody entertain a motion to revise the first one to remain for further discussion at the moment, and the next two, which would be the review and approval by the NRC, and the decommissioning of the financial, that they be tabled for the moment?
Yeah, I would prefer that, so we can discuss it
Are
further.
you going to revise your motion?
Thank you.
Okay. Is there a second on the revised motion? Kevin? Any discussion on the revised motion? Hearing none? All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. All opposed? Any abstentions? Okay. Do we think we captured that, Alan, or do you want me to go through it again? Okay. Which brings us down now to the emergency preparedness.
Decommissioning.
Trust, I missed it. Trust, DTF, yeah. If I could just for a moment. It's now coming up on 8:15. We certainly want to provide citizens an opportunity to speak tonight. I feel like we're making great progress on this. Is the sense of the panel that we'd like to stay longer tonight? Or would you like to wrap up in a timely manner and pick this up in July?
I'm going to have to excuse myself a moment because I have a flight to catch to California first thing in the morning, so. But I
Okay.
can't stay, but if, I'm okay with people staying if they want to. They don't need me here.
Joseph?
I would prefer that Kurt be with us. You've had a lot of good comments and concerns raised as to what the concerns of the Commonwealth may be on whatever goes forward. And I think it would be helpful, even if we have to have another meeting, I don't mind that, but I think it's very important that the co-chair be
Yeah.
here for this because of the substantive input that we've had from him.
Any other thoughts on this?
I agree with Bill.
Okay. Any other? Yes, great. Any other?
Yeah, I think we should break at 8:30.
Okay. If that's the case, then I'd like to bring up one other topic. Clearly, what's evolving in here, because this is the first time I'm aware of anybody's done this process, Jack has been formulating some wordsmithing on each one of these. I think personally, and I was the one that pulled all these pieces together, and I was very hesitant and loath to touch any of the words that were written by the working groups, because I wasn't involved. If there's a sense that between now and when we release version 3 of this, that we can go ahead and make some of these wordsmithing changes. I'd like to just get the consensus of the board without a formal vote. It's okay for us to go and clean this up a little, as long as we don't fundamentally change either the basis of the findings, whatever we call that, or the concept of what we're trying to recommend. Is there anybody opposed to us doing that?
No.
Hearing that, thank you very much. Now we will allow the public to speak. How many folks would like to talk? 1, 2, 3. 3 folks. Perfect, 5 minutes apiece. Mary, help yourself. Yeah.
Yes, what I'm interested in talking about is the loose language by this panel on the term experts. It started out by Dan saying there are no experts on this panel. And I'm looking at Jack, who's head of radiation control at DPH. The letter he presented to us was obviously came from the Executive Secretary of Public Health, approved by the Commissioner of Public Health, and they, of course, defer to Jack as their expert, the state's expert, in this area to provide advice. So it makes me wonder, just that one example, of why this board would even question not supporting the Commonwealth's expert on this issue. What? Are you an epidemiologist? Are you a health expert? Have any of you served on the Beer 7 committee? No. That is the responsibility of the Executive Office of Public Safety, of the Commissioner of Public Health, in conference with Jack. Number 1. Number 2, I've heard discussions, or we have heard from experts already. No, you've heard one-sided reports, valuable as they have been. You've heard from the licensee spokespeople who have a particular interest in going forward. Not that that's not valuable, but that doesn't cover the situation. Then you heard from Bruce Watson. NRC also has an interest in explaining their decisions, whether their decisions are or are not in the interest of the Commonwealth or up to date. So the recommendation that Joe made, well, Entergy could come and tell us about this. I don't think that's appropriate. I think it's appropriate for various times to ask where they are on certain issues. But there are experts in this community, i.e. Massachusetts, who could come and speak. Dr. Gordon Thompson was good enough for the Massachusetts Attorney General to have as their expert on the vulnerability of spent fuel. That's an issue. You could have him come and speak. He has done extensive research on security issues of spent fuel. You could also have someone come in on on Holtec. Have him come, have Dr. Singe the owner of Holtec come and talk as he did out at San Onofre and discuss with those who feel that they are not the most robust casts. See, there are experts to come, and to say that none of you are experts, some are, representing expertise in the state. Others are not experts, but they can give their opinion if they'd spend the time and do research on these important subjects. And so this is what concerns me. And I think and hope that you'll think about it. And I think and hope when you're talking about what the authority the state has or hasn't, instead of giving off the cuff responses, oh, the state doesn't have authority, call the Attorney General's office and have them come and discuss what authority the state does and does not have. And then you'd realize what your recommendations are and whether they're foolish because the state has no authority, or whether they aren't foolish and the state does have authority. And maybe you could have a few other lawyers have discussions too.
Thank you, Mary. We'll break up the family.
Zarovitz from the Pilgrim Legislative Advisory Coalition. I don't know whether or not, this is relative to the placement of the second dry cask pad. I don't know whether or not you've seen the report of the NOAA, National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. They made public a report on June 7th regarding rising tidal levels, but it brings major concerns to the future of the spent fuel stored in dry cask at Pilgrim. Currently, we have the storage pad less than 4 feet, or about 4 feet above the mean high tide level, and very close to the shoreline. This 2017 State of United States High Tide Flooding and 2018 Outlook found more than a quarter of the coastal locations that were studied, they broke records for the most high tide days ever recorded. It shows that the high tide flooding has increased 150% since 2000. We've heard repeatedly that the storage pad is adequate and, quote, all is safe. But those changes are astounding. And our Senator Markey has said, residents living near the Pilgrim site are concerned that Entergy Corporation and the NRC are not taking climate change, flooding, and other environmental threats into sufficient consideration when evaluating the safety of spent nuclear fuel stored on site at the plant. We were lucky that Hurricane Sandy took a different direction than expected, or we might have experienced that one bad day that we know is all that it takes. Entergy has options. They have the means, it has the means and the land to build at a higher location. Experts agree this report should be taken as a warning to prepare ourselves, or where we will be just sitting around, to quote a University of Florida geologist, and waiting for that one day, that disaster to happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan. Jim?
One of the things that I have noticed here is that this panel has been provided, both by us and I assume by others, with a great deal of expert information. Reports of experts who haven't been invited to speak, only Entergy's have, on issues that are critical to this procedure and are critical to making any decisions. I would have hoped to hear some comments from the panel reflecting the fact that they had read those expert reports and appreciated what they said. These weren't my opinion. These were the repeated opinions and giving you the information on what the experts say. And the mere fact that they haven't been invited to show up here and speak to the panel certainly doesn't mean that their expertise can't be taken into consideration. There is a great deal of expertise out there on what is happening in terms of climate and sea rise. I've heard nothing but opinion going back and forth. Those expert reports that Pine has referred to, that Janet just referred to, and other people have referred to, deserve the consideration of this panel. They are not reports by people who have a financial interest in saving money in decommissioning, and not to receive that information, or at least give someone the opportunity to give to you what the experts who aren't on the energy payroll or on the NRC payroll are saying, is not the way to go. One other just minor point, Jack's matrix. One of the things you obviously noticed tonight was a very interesting working groups. Many of them have come up with recommendations, frankly, on the same substantive issues. I think it would be a great deal of help to the panel as it goes forward and looks at these if something like Jack's matrix were prepared so you had all the different wordings in front of you as opposed to moving from one to another. Let's not take this one, let's move to somebody else's. And let me just give a very simple example, which is the standard for cleanup. There are at least 4 different recommendations in the most recent draft. All of them omit some things. Some of them just get rid of the words less than. Most of them don't talk about water. There is also the letter that the experts did provide in terms of what the state DPH thought the recommendation should be. And I would strongly suggest that if you had a matrix in front of you that showed the starting point of that, or where there isn't a starting point with that one, but what the various working groups have recommended and their reasons for recommending it, that would be a much more positive way of working toward an understanding of the recommendation the panel as a whole should make than simply moving, oh, let's move to some other group's recommendations.
Thank you, Jim. Any new business this evening? Selectman?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, a few years ago, Plymouth Board of Selectmen had a representative from the New England ISO in, made a presentation. I was pretty impressed. I didn't know if that was anything you or this committee would be interested in. It was probably 15 to 20 minutes long. They go through the inventory or the process of how the New England ISO came to be. They go through the inventory, the diversity of the portfolio. I think at that point in time, we were probably, Vernon, Vermont had announced that it was going to close. Obviously, since then, Brayton Point will close, and, you know, Pilgrim is on the verge, but that's something that if you had 15 to 20 minutes available at a meeting in October, November, or December, I think that the committee would find pretty informative.
Thank you. Senator?
Yeah, Mr. Chairman, with all due humility, I would really like some direction, because if what this panel is going to be is a panel that is going to try to inform and equip itself so that we become experts to opine on these issues, then I would humbly say to you, this will be my last meeting and I'll resign, because I don't have the capacity to do that. I am an expert at process, okay? And what I thought we were doing as a panel was trying to embrace and suggest a process on behalf of the citizens of the Commonwealth and fund that process, give that process resources, so that on behalf of the citizens, there would be good oversight over a federal agency, which I, for one, have no belief in relative to their capacity to oversee this adequately, and a company which has a financial interest, which may or probably would affect their behavior. And what I'm interested in doing is creating a process that is credible and has the resources to engage those two entities in a way that will be respectful and represent the interests of the citizens of the Commonwealth. If the expectation here is, and I'm being serious, if the expectation is that I'm going to sit here 1 or 2 or 3 hours a month and listen to experts and then try to be an expert and take on the NRC and Entergy on behalf of the citizens, aside from my personal belief that that's absurd, I don't have the capacity to do it, and I won't. So I thought the whole idea of an interagency working group and giving them through the legislature the capacity with resources to engage appropriately and inform themselves on behalf of the citizens was the road we were going down. Now, I didn't mean to say we didn't have experts here. We have a lot of experts here, and I respect them greatly, and I'm loving everybody here. But we're not a panel of experts. We're a panel that has a few experts on it, and we're well-intentioned. But I guess I want direction. I'm a little bit frustrated because the wordsmithing, I don't talk about rearranging the deck chairs. I mean, what I'm hearing is wordsmithing, and I guess I feel like we're not seeing the forest through the trees. Because the victory here is a process outcome. It's not a substantive outcome.
I don't agree.
And I will respectfully say again, if that's not the consensus of the group, I'm fine. We'll ask the Senate President to appoint someone who actually has the time and capacity to become the expert necessary to weigh in on this. I know an expert when I hear one, but I can't get inside their head and gain all the knowledge that they have. So.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I don't agree with that. And I don't think this panel needs to be a panel of experts. What the panel needs to do, because our charge is not to take on the licensee, and our charge is not to take on the NRC. Our charge is to provide recommendations to help inform the public and recommendations to the executive branch, not to take on the two entities you just mentioned.
What if it's needed?
That is not in our charge, Dan.
What if it's needed?
Gentlemen?
And I think, I've been on all kinds of panels, and yes, you can have experts for every person on the panel. You can also have people who aren't experts on a particular topic, but who are given the opportunity to do the kind of research that may be needed on however many topics we've got to deal with, avail themselves of the technical data that was mentioned earlier, that exists, all kinds of technical data that exists in reports that exist. Many panels in Washington, and I suspect at the state level, are not just populated by experts. They're populated by people who give their all to try and do the best they can on doing the research into the topics, providing the recommendations that they believe will benefit the Commonwealth in this particular regard. But I think the constant criticism of this panel that we don't have any expertise or it's extremely limited, I, one, am offended by that. Number two, it kind of reminds me of the kinds of comments I remember that occurred down in Washington when I was there, when the ACA was being debated, and the Speaker of the House was asked about a particular provision in it, and the comment from the Speaker of the House was, the legislator, you have to pass the law before you know what's in it. So much for the legislative process.
That'll be, for tonight's discussion, let me have one chair's prerogative, and I'm going to give you both a comment before I entertain a motion to adjourn. We have done remarkable stuff in the time period. We have, in fact, working closely with the state partners, begun that process. The Secretary Beaton is beginning to assemble that interagency working group. My understanding is that some funding may actually survive for this. It's not done yet as far as I know, but I think it's going to survive. We're a year out. We're much more ahead of where we were. But as you, each of us tonight, certainly our friends from the public, see, it's a work in progress. We're trying to figure out how to do it the best way possible. I find myself agreeing with both of you, and I think many of our fellow panel members do. We don't want you to leave. It is a process, and we're making progress towards getting that place where we can see the interagency working group doing what they need to be doing. But at the same time, we've got to fulfill our mission, which is an advisory opinion. We've got to give our advice. That's what we've got to do. You wrote the legislation, you know better than anyone. So I think we've made significant progress towards doing both. I think the nature of what we're trying to wrestle through here, we've got at least 3 very distinctive groups of people here that pulling this together each month and all the volunteer activities, you're right, it's a lot of time. But I would just ask for a little bit more patience, Senator, and I hope you can give us more of your time for at least a little while longer so you see the progress that's being made. With that, I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved. Second.
Okay. All in favor? Aye.
Well said.